Today I'm going to be doing a rear tie rod replacement on a 99 C5 Corvette with about 90,000 miles on it. That part's also known as a toe link. And let's start out by lifting the car. This is the way I like to do it, with a 2x6 under the frame. And I like the ramps better than jack stands. I just feel that the car is more stable on the ramps. I don't like to drive the car up on the ramps. I prefer to jack it up and then put the ramps under the wheels. And the ramps give you better access in a lot of cases. So I'm going to put a ramp on under the driver's side wheel here, and on the passenger side I'll use the lift point with a hockey puck and a couple of 2x4s on a ramp there. And that'll give me nice access to that passenger side rear wheel area. Now, one of the things I'll do is put the lug nuts on backwards and just screw them up against the brake disc, just hand tight. And I'm going to use a Black & Decker laser level set on vertical pattern, and a couple of clamps clamped to the brake disc, and I'll mark the point where the lasers fall, just so I have a reference there. And now we can start on that tie rod end. That's a 18mm nut with an Allen wrench in the center to stop that center shaft from turning. Now, this rod can squeak from either end, and it sounds exactly the same either way, so it can be pretty hard to tell which end is the problem, and it can also be intermittent. Now, the first time I had a squeak in this area, I took it to the dealer and they drove it and they couldn't find a problem. They charged me $90 for their trouble. But the squeak was always sensitive to water, and one day I hit a puddle and it started the squeaking, so I ran it back down to the dealership, and that time they replaced a tie rod in and charged me $340 for that. And all was well for about 6 months when the sound came back, and I determined it was the inner tie rod this time, and that I would take a shot at fixing it myself. So a stethoscope might help you. I was also able to take the tie rod end loose and just kind of exercise that whole rod for the inner tie rod joint, and sometimes the squeak would go away for maybe 3 weeks, and that might help you determine which end is the problem. But now let's have a look at that retaining nut. And this is the only thing that holds the tie rod to the frame. It's a 15/16 or 24mm one-time use nut, and a service manager at my dealership told me that the tie rod's screwed into the frame, and that I would need a special tool to get onto the flats that you see there on that tie rod end, and in order to screw it out. But it turns out that once you take the nut loose, the retaining nut, the whole thing loosens up, and you don't need any special tie rod tools to do this job at all. Now, this nut's a bit difficult to get at, and here's some tools that I found useful on the job. Got the socket that fits the nut, a Harbor Freight plug that goes into the socket and gives you a 3/4 inch bolt handle, and then a 3/4 inch socket on a swivel extension, and the Harbor Freight articulated ratchet, and that's real good for getting into tight positions there. And you could probably remove the exhaust pipe to get better clearance here, but that's a lot more work. And at the height I've got the car, I don't know that the muffler would come out. You could also try removing the sway bar, but I don't know if that would get you much clearance there. You can kind of see how that ratchet is getting me up in there. But on the subject of the sway bar, there's another noise this car can make, and you might have heard it if you're going over a speed bump. It sounds like a creaky door hinge or something, or rubber grating against metal, and that could be your bushing there, the sway bar bushing. And I found if you take that out and just coat the areas that contact metal with a little bit of dielectric grease, that might just solve your problem. Of course, you could replace the bushings, but they are a little pricey. Now back to the tie rod end. I'm just going to give a couple love taps here to that end to get it out. You don't want to hit it hard. And if you're going to do that, run the nut up to protect the threads before you do it. Now if yours is tougher, here's a separator tool that you could use. You don't want to use a pickle fork or anything that is going to damage that tie rod end boot. And now that the inner retaining nut has been removed, we can take the whole thing out of the car. Now over at the bench, I'm going to count very carefully the threads. I'll use a blade to do that. I'm going to count up to the jam nut there. Also, just for fun, I'm going to take a measurement from the jam nut to the groove of the first thread as a reference. I'm going to write that down in case I need it. And I'm going to take one more measurement of the overall length of the tie rod. Now while we're at it, let's have a look at that inner tie rod joint. I cut the metal clamp off with a Dremel tool, and you can see this looks pretty bad. It's metal dust and shards. This thing's falling apart. Now you could remove the boot with the rod still on the car if you wanted to check out the condition of the joint, if you were having trouble identifying which end was squeaking. If you saw something like this, you'd know where the problem was. And you can put the boot back on with a plastic zip tie if you don't want to go with the original type of clamp, which is called an O-ticker, which requires a special tool. And Harbor Freight also makes a metal zip tie, as does Dorman. I'd like to also point out there that you see some scratches around the barrel of this part, as if someone was trying to get it off, like they thought the thing screwed out from the frame, like that service manager told me. And you can also see to the far right side there where someone has actually taken a Dremel tool or something and tried to grind some new flats on it, maybe to get a tie rod tool on it. They messed the surface up where the boot seals with that part, and maybe water got in there and rust started, and I ended up with this mess. Now here I am with the new part. I'm counting off the threads again, and I'll just run that jam nut right up against the blade, and then we'll put the tie rod end back on. Now, I'd recommend thread lock for the jam nut, but you don't want to use it on the end itself. You want that part to be adjustable. And now I measure again with my gauge, and I find something's not right here. It's off by just a little bit. It's hard to see in the shot, but it's enough to make me suspicious that the geometry of this part is different. I don't doubt it's the right part, but when I put the clamp on there, you can see it's off by almost a ½ inch. So I ended up setting up the rod to fit that space that I'd measured with the clamp, and I figure, well, we'll put it back in and see where the laser hits. I didn't have a whole lot of choice at that point. So we get that inner tie rod end into its groove, and then very carefully we're going to put that outer end back in the knuckle, being very careful not to damage the boot. And we'll put the retaining nut on now and just leave that loose. Now the inner tie rod end fits only one way, and you can see how those flats fit into that slot. So they're going to be vertical, and you want to be careful when you're tightening the nut that you don't push it so hard that you push the that inner tie rod end out of its slot. And you might want to restrain the brake drum from moving while you're doing that. So this nut is very tight, even though it's rated at 44 foot-pounds. There were several times I thought it was tight enough that I was finished. And eventually I thought I needed to use half-inch socket stuff, and so I was able to get a socket in there with just a standard half-inch Craftsman socket with a wobble extension. Very tight, but it is doable. Now the manual says for that outside retaining nut 15 pounds initially, and then rotate another 160 degrees, and then check it for a minimum torque of 33 foot-pounds. Now I just put 40 on and kept turning it, and you can feel that washer compress. And when everything was tightened back up, it looked to me like it was off by maybe 1 degree based on what I was seeing by the laser. So I apologize for not having this procedure, but the batteries died about this time. So to adjust that rod, I put a wrench on the tie rod end so that it doesn't rotate and you don't damage it, and break the nut loose, the jam nut, and then further back on the tie rod you'll see some flats that you can put an adjustable wrench on, and you can just turn the whole tie rod to bring the wheel in or out as you need it. And after I had everything back together, I took it back to the dealer, and they said it was spot on. So the procedure with the laser level seemed to work pretty well. I was pleased with that. So that's it for this money-saving repair job, and we'll see you next time.